Maybe before we get started with the material, I wanted to share that I mentioned those three C's, the curiosity, courage, and well, compassion and courage. That's coming from an organization called Starts With Us. This is the one that I mentioned something about bridge building, but essentially that's their program. So you can go to there, starts with us, starts with .us. It's kind of interesting. I didn't realize that about their web address. So it starts with .us anyway. And then I think it's, you mentioned Mary Better Angels, but I think it's Braver Angels possibly. I don't know. Yeah, I did. There's another organization called Better Angels, but it sounded like they were about storytelling of Americans and things, and might be the maybe the Braver Angels, which is a nice phrase too. But the idea, oh no, 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 it's no worries. Because yeah, it sounds like they're really about trying to do a cross-partisan, efforts and things. So I think that's probably them. Yeah. So again, know that there are these things out there to kind of go to and see what resources they have to offer and things that you can do. Um, So back into humility, let me check again. There was that question that we had on screen about your own experiences around seeing humility in yourself or others. Any comments, particularly from folks who are online with us? Anyone want to share anything there or here in the Gompa again? We'll just kind of wrap up humility soon, but call it a wrap. Yes, please, Mary. Microphone is where? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Isabella.
I'm not sure how everybody else feels about this, but in the workplace,
Mm,
I don't think humility is encouraged.
mm,
And it is also considered a sign of weakness.
mm,
So we're battling against what is expected of us.
yeah,
And it can, if you do tend to be a humble person who can admit their mistakes,
mm,
that can really go against you.
yeah,
And so that's a hard thing to be who you are and then be castigated for it.
mm.
Or not sure that was the right word, but
Yeah,
punished for that.
right. No, thanks, Mary, for bringing that up. I think we do have a culture that embraces the people who are more prideful and kind of putting themselves, asserting themselves over others, and all of that. And so it is difficult. Yeah. It's interesting. In the Mahayana tradition, we have what are called the bodhisattva vows. Bodhisattvas, those beings who are intent upon working for the welfare of others and becoming a Buddha, so you can do that perfectly. And the very first of the 18 main bodhisattva vows, these are the ones that if you break, you kind of break the vow, is praise to avoid praising oneself and belittling others. You look at how many job interviews you go to where, you have to really watch that you're not engaging in that kind of activity. Now, again, it's spelled out in terms of this is out of attachment and desire and what have you that you would be doing this. But it's such a common thing in our culture for people to want to praise themselves, talk about their own abilities, their own skills, inflate their own idea of who they are for an employer and to put other people down necessarily. Maybe you don't have to do that for every job interview, but in the workplace, that's often called upon. You really want to kind of show that you're the star, you're the person who they can depend upon. So it's a tough one. I don't know if there's a perfect answer to that because obviously it would be great if we could be in a workplace where we didn't have that, but that's not always the case. Even in Dharma centers, that's not always the case. Yeah, Christy, do you want to share something on that? Or,
Yeah, I think it starts in our education system too. It's not
yeah,
just a workplace. I mean, that's the way we're trained to be
true.
consumers. But um, I wanted to point out that there's there's ways of being humble that don't put yourself down and that don't. So there is a fine tightrope to walk where you can kind of follow your vows and
Mhm.
still be humble.
Mhm.
But that also there's a time frame that happens between when you change your behavior and when people start to appreciate it instead of putting you down. And sometimes you have to be willing to just keep doing the thing you know is right, and things will change around you. I
Mm.
believe so.
Thanks for sharing that, Chris. That is true. Yeah. I mean, the more that we sort of stick to our guns and do what we need to do and abide by the views and the perspectives that we have in life, the more maybe things start changing with others. But yeah. Any other comments on humility? It's a tough one, I think. And again, sometimes you don't always see that connection with joy because, you know, he's like, remind me why I'm supposed to be joyful doing this again, you know. Yes, Lindsay.
Well, I just wanted to say, Mary, I totally relate to what you're describing because it's really challenging at work sometimes to
Mm.
live these teachings like that we're listening to. They kind of sound ideal right now. And then you're in a situation where
Mm.
it's really challenging. And I guess I was thinking of this idea of like, if there's something really customarily true about what you're saying about the workplace and competition and the way that humility is viewed versus, you know, puffing your chest out and taking credit, then there's also like, ultimately at the end of the day, what way is effective for me to feel good about how I handled it? And that is probably the more enduring thing that I'm trying to pay attention to, because how it all plays out, I
Mm.
really can't control that. And I say this only just out of deep connection to struggling with it, not because I feel like I've figured it out or have any special insight about it, but I'm just, there
Mhm.
is sort of like, okay, this is conventionally true and this is what's rewarded here. And then in the other way, there's sort of like, but ultimately, you know, how do I feel about what I did today? And do I have peace of mind that I did my best today? And, you know,
Mhm.
that kind of thing.
No. And I think the work culture, I've been out of the work culture for a while, so I'm not the best person to talk to about this. I've been doing Dharma teaching for quite a while, though that does involve some work settings. But nonetheless, it's very different from when I worked for Levi Strauss just up the way in San Francisco for 18 years. So I was in accounting and finance. I went from that to teaching Dharma. I don't know how that quite happened, um, but the I do gather that there is some shift in workplace culture around people being more team players and really wanting to acknowledge the contributions of others and not be so much tooting one's own horn, perhaps, and that being an admirable quality. That, you know, they do want workplaces where people do work together and they have that kind of synergy and things happening. So I think, yeah, we can stay true to our own principles, how we want to be, and maybe the culture changes in response to that. Yeah, Elena, please.
I think it's possible to be humble and do your job with excellence. Um, when you master your skills,
Mhm.
you receive respect
Mhm.
and understanding, and uh, your coworkers pay attention to what you are saying or doing.
Mhm.
So I think
Wonderful.
so.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I think that that is one of the effects. Yeah, Patrick wants to share something.
I just wanted to share. I'm thinking about like trusting that humility what has the result that I could be more like the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop, just trusting that something good is going to happen, because doubting it with like that it would lead to me giving up opportunities or
Yeah.
something. Just go, okay, they wouldn't put it in the book as one of the biggest things. If and
Yeah, it's like their seal of approval makes it definitely something we should pay attention to and not just say, oh, well, that one, I'll just go with 7 pillars. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Patrick. Anyone else before we kind of conclude humility? We've got a few more slides to show, but okay. Let's go back to our slides. Let me make sure there's a comment in the box here. Oh, that's just from Isabella. Okay. All right, good. Okay, good. Yeah, and again, there's no requirements even here in the Gompa for people to necessarily say something, but I do like things being more interactive, and it's good that people are participating in that way. So everything's fine. Let's go back to our slides. Um, I threw this question out there as well. What effects have you noticed that humility has on your relationships? Mhm. Yeah, Carol, did you want to speak to this? Yeah, great.
I think for me, it's quieting when I'm have that humility mind.
Mhm.
It quiets me that I actually really listen better to the other person. I think the quality of my relationship deepens, and
Mhm.
I find people more interesting, and I see a softening in I perceive to be a softening in them. It just opens that dialogue where um, I'm not ramming my ideas or ramming my thoughts. Just
Okay.
really having them. So that's what I've seen that comes to mind.
Yeah, no, that's great. And thanks, Carol, for sharing that. Yeah. Anyone else? Ah, Mary, please, when the microphone gets there.
I think in my relationship with Phil,
Mhm.
that humility plays a very large part
Mm.
because we both make mistakes. But when we make mistakes, we support each other
Right.
and don't make each other feel worse about it. We already feel badly.
Sure.
So making you feel worse about it would only, make it worse. So
Mm.
in a relationship, I think it's very important.
Mm. That's great. Thanks, Mary, for sharing that. You're blessed with having a couple that can do that, because sometimes the dynamic can be very different, and people. You, we would say you had the karma to find it in Buddhism, but this is an important aspect of relationships, is to be able to acknowledge, whether it be an intimate relationship or family, friends, what have you. Yeah, we don't have it all. That curiosity again about who someone else is, what their points of view are, and what their needs are, is really an important one to take frequently. Um, One thing I came to mind in talking about humility, I haven't had the opportunity to participate in this, but my dear friend Tenzin Choki said that she was part of it when they did this human library thing here in Santa Cruz. You've heard of the human library, right? Where you take out a person. No, essentially that's what you're doing. They have people who volunteer to come to have like a little label put on them, like, one of them that she mentioned that was kind of an interesting one. She was trying to find somebody for this, was to play a Republican in Santa Cruz, because admittedly, this is a more liberal part of the country. And so they would have a label there, and you come to this and you go and you sit down, and for so many minutes you talk to that person, and you just really be receptive. Again, you're not there to change that person into a Democrat or whatever, libertarian or whatever other party you want to change them to. You're there to get to know who this person is, to hear their perspective, to hear their life story, or whatever it is that they feel they want to share. And so, again, it's a more contrived environment to do that, but it ends up being very enlightening for people. They sit down with a trans person, someone who has transitioned from one gender to another. You sit down with people who are, doing things that you might not find that palatable, but you hear their point of view. You know, who is that person? Again, I think there's a sense of humility that comes with that too, when we actually see that everyone's got a story. Everyone has their own thing that makes them who they are. And to have that, as Carol was saying, to be able to put aside your own stuff and to just be curious about who that person is, that's already an amazing act of humility. Yeah, I don't know if they do this regularly. I think the concept was started in England, actually, of the human library, and they even trademarked it or something like that. So, but if it ever happens, you might want to go and just sort of see who's there to check out, and what what you might learn from being with people who are different than you in particular. We tend to gravitate towards what is the same for us, and that almost becomes a reinforcement of our own inflation of ourselves or feelings about ourselves. You can be with people who are actually different, can learn a lot. So I think that's part of this teaching. Anyone online or again in the Gompa here, anything more to share? with that question? Yes, Aaron, please.
Maybe just to touch on when you mentioned the human library, I've had the privilege of documenting a whole series at the Redwood City Public Library
Oh, wow.
where, and what I wanted to add to what you've already said, and hopefully this is helpful, is also, you know, at the time that things do come up for us in our own practices,
Mhm.
I find that that's the best time to question or ask those questions. So, what's interesting about the human library when it pops up is like with the election, or at the time, you know, there was a Muslim mother who lived locally who
Mhm.
people checked out and was asking about just kind of war and other things. But
Mhm.
she really identified as being a soccer mom. And I think that threw a lot of people off in a good way,
Right.
where it just instantly reduces any anxiety
Yeah.
or stress or something. And
Interesting.
just seeing her that way, it really, I think, softened other people
Uh-huh.
to seeing that there's so many different identities out there, and
Sure.
what we're seeing could be blinding us a little
Mhm.
bit.
Mhm.
So, but the timing, like if there's something that's coming up for you in your own practice, like trying to get after it then is probably the most ripe
That's a good
time.
point. That's a good point. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Aaron. I'm glad that you've done some work around the human library, because to me, it's in any of these ideas that get us out of just our own little stuff and our own little point of view. Because again, pride often takes root when we have that sense of, look at how wonderful I am and my views and my way of being in the world. But there's so many others that are doing something that's very different. And also some things that are quite the same, you know, the soccer mom thing or whatever, that you have to kind of break down our own stereotypes, our own views that we get from the media, from so many other places. So let's go back to the slides again, unless there was anything anyone wanted to share. Okay. All right. Just a few little things to tidy up this whole thing on humility. Concluding thoughts. When we have humility, we can actually laugh at ourselves. It was surprising to hear the Archbishop and the Dalai Lama describe the importance of a proper sense of humor, which of course is our next pillar, and especially the ability to laugh at our own foibles as essential to the cultivation of joy. This is what we're getting into humor next. Humor is here going to be in the idea of laughing at ourselves more than it is at laughing at others with some kind of mean-spiritedness or something. Though we can often laugh at each other, as the Dalai Lama and Archbishop would do very frequently. You do have on your little chart or your little sheet the practice suggestions. Actually, let me, instead of going to this, let me pull that up, because I haven't actually pulled that up since I introduced it last night. Here is the document that again is out on the Google Drive that I put together. So again, on this first page are just brief descriptions of these pillars. So again, for humility, just to remind ourselves, it's diminishing self-importance and acknowledging how much we need others from, a place of understanding interdependence. So the second pillar practices, as it says here, recalling a time when you accomplished something that you are proud of. Reflect on what you did, but without generating a prideful mind, and then examine how others also played a role in your success. Nobody becomes a Nobel Prize winner on their own. Might acknowledge the one person or maybe a small group of people, but there are often many other beings, many other people involved. Does this recognition help you to cultivate humility and yet also acknowledge your own contribution? Take note of any internal shift from generating humility. Then the second one, when you are among others, see if you can bring to mind the essence of that verse. You don't have to memorize the verse. When in the company of others, I shall always consider myself the lowest of all, and from the depths of my heart hold others dear and supreme. Notice what happens internally when you try to practice humility in that way. So again, this is something that we can do maybe even during our little break here, is just as we interact with each other's, what's it like? Maybe pay attention to how many of the black rocks are coming up for you when you start thinking about yourself, and how many of them are white rocks where you're actually honestly, truly engaged in the other person and thinking of them, thinking of what they might need at the moment. Um, so again, this is just one way to approach it. I'm sure, as I said last night, there are many other practices of humility that can be adopted. but it's important that we take some of these away. By the way, I will go ahead and give this advice now, though I'll probably do it tomorrow when we conclude. You're going to get a lot of these practices then over the course of 3 days, right? Don't think that you have to adopt them all right at once. Just like that cultivating bodhicitta that I mentioned just a short while ago this morning, where you generate these positive thoughts while you turn on the lights or go to the bathroom or whatever. You can't take them all on at once. It takes us a while to acquire a habit. So just take one or two of these that you feel are important for you. So as we go through these, you may say, well, yeah, I think I really need to work on my humility. Instead of focusing on the other ones for now, I'm going to work on that. And then you work with these practices until you start seeing some shift. And then you can carry on that practice more naturally because it's something you've gotten used to. That's what practice is essentially in Buddhism or any spiritual tradition. It's becoming familiar with. In fact, the word we use, some of you who are not Buddhists may be curious about this place we meet in called the Gompa. Gom is the Tibetan word for meditation, but it technically means becoming familiar. So meditation or any practice is about becoming familiar with salutary states and ways of thinking that are really good for us and avoiding those that are more challenging and negative and problematic. That's how we change our minds. That's how we change our experience. So again, don't think that you have to adopt every one of these practices or both practices for even any one of these pillars. Find what works for you. And even if you find something that is not listed here that is a practice that supports it, go for it. You have carte blanche when it comes to working with these things. Are we ready to move on to humor? Need some laughs? It's been a pretty light group. I'm very happy with everyone's sense of humor so far. Maybe you're not happy with mine, but okay, these are things you should never lose. This is my little cartoon I found for this. There's these guys that are trying to cross this huge chasm from one side to the other. Don't lose your sense of humor, your balance, your perspective, or your keys. Okay, so again, I like that they put perspective on there because once more we go back to that first pillar and are reminded that your sense of humor often is a product of your perspective. How you're going about your life and living your life is very much in tune with how you're looking at life and whether you can laugh at yourself, whether you can actually bring a sense of humor and go, wow, yeah, there I stepped in it again. No big deal. Have an ability to kind of be much lighter around things that happen. So it was clear that humor was central to their joyful way of being, but why was laughter so central? This is Douglas Abrams wondering this when he's looking at the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop. I once heard that laughter was the most direct line between two people. And certainly these two used humor to break down the social barriers that separate us. I mean, they really are it's quite phenomenal that they found a friendship in there when they're coming from such two extremely different backgrounds. I mean, one being raised in the Potala, the huge palace that's there in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet, and having this amazing kind of monastic life in this region that's, I don't know, kind of otherworldly. And then the other one coming from South Africa and dealing with, of course, apartheid and so many of the challenges there. But they had also many commonalities and things that brought them together. And of course, their sense of humor, you can see. I mean, I won't necessarily show you all the videos. You can go to YouTube and just put in their names and you'll get all these amazing videos of them laughing together and being interviewed and kind of joking with each other. Um, it's quite amazing. Humor, just like humility, apparently comes from the same root word, the Latin word for humanity, humus. Humus is at the root of all of these words. The lowly and sustaining earth is the source for all three of these. Is it any surprise that we have to have a sense of humility to be able to laugh at ourselves, and that to laugh at ourselves reminds us of our shared humanity? I like this phrase shared humanity. I don't know that we use it as often as what we should, but there is something about being able to see that this is something that we all deal with. You were talking earlier, Mary, about how you and Phil, I won't put Phil on the spot with anything, but you make mistakes. We all make mistakes, right? We all do things that we regret. And you go, wow, yeah, stepped in it again. But to be able to have an ability to see that that's part of our shared humanity. None of us are exempt. You know, I think even the Dalai Lama, there's one instance where he was saying something to the translator about something that, was he was really intent that he was sure was right. And then the translator pointed out that it was actually not right. And he was like, oh, he laughed at himself and, oh, I was really so confused and sorry I did that. And da, da, da. So even the Dalai Lama makes mistakes. We can be reminded that this is a human condition that we all have. Every one of us is going to step in it or be subject to having people see sides of us that we're maybe a little embarrassed about initially, but we can begin to laugh at ourselves and look at ourselves as, yeah, I'm a work in progress too. Not perfect. So this is an important part of humor, is to be able to have that lightness, really key to having joy in our lives. So let's go on to the next slide. He says, no doubt about it. One component of kindness. I'm sorry, this is moving. I should have explained where I'm going here. I'm moving into a little book that I have that's called The Power of Kindness by Piero Ferrucci. It's done a lot of work around psychology and things. Nice little book. It's not Buddhist per se, but he does talk about Buddhism sometimes in there. One component of kindness is a happy disposition, and akin to happiness is humor, a capacity to see the contradictions and absurdities of our life and not take ourselves too seriously. Anyone who has this quality is safe from emotional inflation and the dramas of everyday life. If we can just be light going about our business and doing what we do and not take ourselves so damn seriously. I mean, my gosh. And this is again, going back to our culture we're living in right now, everything seems so deadly serious. And yes, there are serious things that we do need to know, kind of take somewhat seriously, but have a sense of humor about it too. Be able to have some lightness in the midst of what might seem like darkness. For instance, it has been discovered that humor makes us more creative. Subjects who had just seen a comic film were actually faster at solving a practical problem than the others who had not done that. Humor has also been found to have the power to relieve physical pain, and that's no small virtue. People who are dealing with physical pain, if they can introduce some sense of humor, and what's that, the film Patch Adams, right? About the Robin Williams playing the doctor who would, bring a lightness to people dealing with really serious conditions. I mean, there's something to be said for the power of humor to break down so much stuff and really get it to the core of this shared sense of being with others and being with ourselves in our own humility. We also know that humor strengthens the immune system, lowers blood pressure, and reduces stress. Quite a result. But it is better to not analyze humor too much and to talk about it in small doses. So I'm going to try to do the same thing here. He actually shares this, Piero Ferrucci. He says, a long time ago, I made the mistake of running an entire workshop on humor. It was the most depressing one I had ever given. As Mark Twain said, studying humor is like vivisecting a frog. You just end up with a dead frog. So humor is one of those things that you don't want to analyze too much. You just want to kind of enjoy it and be with it. And I don't know. I do find I watch some comedians on Netflix and what have you, but I tend to like the humor that's much more about that kind of shared humanity that can laugh at the comedians laughing at themselves, but you also can see your own stuff around whatever. Whereas the comedians that are really like doing stuff that's hateful or putting other people down is just not so pleasant to listen to. You kind of feel, I don't think I should be laughing at this. You know, at least that's my experience. So I think again, when we see that humor, that really helps us to connect and see, hey, we're not just all in this together. We're all pretty much the same when it comes down to it in regard to some pretty fundamental stuff. We're all going to have foibles. We're all going to have faults. We're all going to make mistakes. And we can all laugh about it, hopefully. I mean, I think we've probably all been around people who couldn't laugh at their mistakes or couldn't laugh at things, and how sad that is to see. Let's look at a few of the things. I don't think we need to belabor humor, as I said, and as was just said by Piero Ferrucci, but its relationship to joy, I think, is pretty evident. The role of humor, particularly in reducing tension. Maybe this is a good one to talk about a little bit, especially in the times that we're living in. And then humor as a force for unity, also a very important topic, bringing people together through humor. It's much better when there is not too much seriousness, the Dalai Lama responded. Laughter, joking is much better. Then we can be completely relaxed. He says he met some scientists in Japan and they explained that wholehearted laughter, not artificial laughter, is very good for your heart and your health in general. And it said that when he was saying this about artificial laughter, he pretended to smile and forced to chuckle. You know, sometimes we do that, right? He was making a connection between wholehearted laughter and a warm heart, which he had already said was the key to happiness. Yeah. So when we laugh and laugh with others, it does shift something. It does open our hearts more. We feel that sense of warmth and connection. Yeah. It's obviously evident that it produces joy. On the role of humor in reducing tension. This is the Archbishop talking now. He says, we tend to want to blow ourselves up, inflate ourselves, because most of us have tended to have a poor self-image. When you're in a situation such as the one in South Africa where you were discriminated against, it was very easy to lose your sense of self. And humor seems to do something for people. Again, look at our culture and how much have we introduced a sense of humor into what we're dealing with. It's hard sometimes because, right, I'm not saying that this election is inconsequential. It's very consequential for the United States and the world. But can we have some lightness around it? I mean, I think for many of us, when Kamala Harris came in and they talked about her campaign kind of injecting joy back into the election process, of course, and I've seen some articles saying, well, the joy bubbles burst now, it's like that was fun. That's why we need things like this that are more sustainable forms of joy. Things that we can actually rely upon that we're not, again, contingent upon an injection of something new or some novelty that we go, oh yeah, now there's joy. But humor helps, and again, give some of that back, helps us be in touch with that. It's hard. I'm dealing with my own stuff, obviously. This is something that I think we all contend with in terms of what's going on in our country and wanting to be in a more joyful place. But if we can bring some lightness and humor, I think we'll have a much better chance of making it through this, seeing the other side, and certainly having better results on the other side. Humor certainly did one good thing. It deflated and diffused a particularly tense situation. This is Archbishop talking about. He's talking about particularly his talk that he gave to the Hutus and the Tutsis of Rwanda and how humor helped to dissolve barriers. Let me actually, whoops, I shouldn't mean to quite go out of that. I have to go back to it in a moment. Let's pull up the passage from the Book of Joy on this, because again, I do think that it's really quite nice to go through. The Archbishop had visited Rwanda shortly after the genocide and was asked to give a talk to the Hutus and the Tutsis. How does one talk about a wound that is so fresh in the soul of a people? The Archbishop's solution, as it so often is, was to speak truth to power through humor. He began telling a story about the big nose people and the small nose people, and how the big nose people were excluding the small nose people, and the people in the audience were laughing. And as they were laughing, they suddenly realized what he was talking about, the ridiculousness of prejudice and hatred, whether in his country or theirs. Humor was, as he said, a very powerful weapon. And I don't have a video of him doing this. It would be wonderful to hear the Archbishop telling this story and getting people to laugh. It kind of reminded me of the Star-Bellied. It's a book by Dr. Seuss. Some of you know this one. What is it called? There's
Sneetches, the star-bellied sneetches.
yeah. The Sneetches, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, the Sneetches that have, some of them have stars on their belly and some don't. And like the ones that had stars on their belly were initially the favored ones, and the ones that didn't weren't. And then it became the opposite. And it's like this, I don't know, we do this so much, right? And if we can look at how humanity does this silly stuff, like classifying people and putting them in categories, and these are better and these are worse. And we look at what we do with fashion in this world. I mean, I'm not a victim of fashion, but a lot of people, really get caught up in, how they dress and what they wear and da da da, and that's so important. And people who don't dress that way are inferior and da da da. I mean, look at this again, humanity's got a lot of strange habits. So if we can actually laugh at it a bit and look at it and go, yeah, why are we doing this? That's one means of breaking down some of those barriers in that way that we tend to classify ourselves as better, others as worse. Again, we can see humor and humility have a lot of connections. The more we can laugh at ourselves, the more humbler we become. And the more humble we become, the more we can laugh at ourselves. Very much connected. Let's go back to the slides again. I'm going to have to pull up the slideshow again here because I shouldn't have done that, taken it off. It's okay. Scientific research on humor in terms of reducing tension, it's rather limited, but it does seem that there's an evolutionary role for laughter and humor in managing the anxiety and stress of the unknown. Jokes are funny precisely because they break our expectations and help us to accept the unexpected. Humor usually is about doing that, like kind of it's going in one direction and then all of a sudden, we see something different, something surprises us. Humor often has that element of surprise, kind of breaking our expectations. But nonetheless, it's not really a lot of studies on it, but I think it does play a pretty key role. I mean, we can certainly see that people who are more self-absorbed and serious and don't really want to laugh, that I can't imagine that they have good physical health because it just doesn't allow things to kind of flow real freely. We get the microphone for Chris. Wanted to add a comment, please. Yeah. Or question. Yeah.
I don't know how much science is behind it, but has anyone ever participated in laughter yoga? Where you
I haven't.
just, yeah, I've done it just on Zoom. I'd love to do it in person, but you just you just laugh together, and it's forced laughter, but it doesn't matter. Your body interprets any kind of laugh. Once you actually get doing it, not pretending to do it, but really laughing, your body reacts and does those lowering of blood pressure and relieving of stress, whether you really,
Ah,
found the situation funny or not to begin with. And laughing together with people has these actual physical effects. And I think there is some science behind it, but I know there's a lot of experience.
sure.
But it's
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah. Sounds great, Chris. And I imagine that what happens is why you might force it initially, that it almost becomes more natural because you're in this environment where it's funny that you're all there laughing together, becomes, I don't know, self-supporting. That's great. I don't know if we can quite do that here. I'm not an official teacher of laughter yoga. So, Patrick.
I've done the laughter yoga, but when she mentioned it, I felt vulnerable just hearing about going there and doing the laughter yoga because it seems like such a hard thing to sign up for and go to participate in. But it does once she's right. Once you're there, it's beneficial.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. We do have someone, Monica, online. Can you unmute and share, please?
So I have participated in laughter yoga a number of times, and I've actually taught it to kids. And it is amazing, like especially with kids, they're coming into class having a bad day, or just having a lot of big emotions. And at the end of class, you're like, today's the best day. So yeah, it does amazing things. I love it.
Thanks for bringing that up, Monica, and especially this idea of kids. When we were kids, we'd laugh till the cows came home, as we would say in Missouri, or Wisconsin for that matter, but wherever there are cows. So, I think we lose touch with a lot of that when we grow up and we kind of like become a little more calloused around, oh, I can't really waste my time laughing and whatever, but I don't know. There's something about that. I appreciate you sharing that because I think kids in particular are a wonderful thing to be around or to even think of, and like the joy that children take. Actually, in our Buddhist practice, we often talk about having this joy. One of the aspects of it, or one of the sort of powers that we bring to exacerbate a joyous enthusiasm for what we're doing, is to have this sense of joy like a child in play. You know, how long have we really, and I do appreciate that. I think there's a lot more emphasis on those sorts of things now than there was perhaps, years ago, where adults are encouraged to do coloring books or to do things that are just getting back in touch with more kind of childlike behavior. But children have a lot to teach us. And so I'm glad to hear that there were those sorts of experiences in schools with laughter yoga. Any other comments on that before we head back to the slides? Yeah, please, Lindsay. Patrick's getting his exercise today.
I was just thinking that in the Alcoholics Anonymous tradition, there's this phrase, fake it till you make it.
Uh,
And even in my exposure to Buddhism, there's sort of the idea of kind of having some contrived, you're just really trying to do your best. You don't feel the perfect alignment of like just spontaneous laughter from yourself, but you choose to laugh anyway, perhaps in the hope that over time it becomes more of your habit and your instinct. And so I just was thinking of that when you were talking about the laughter yoga, that there's other places in the teachings I've noticed where it does talk about, making that choice, even if it feels a little contrived at first, and then seeing and learning over time what the effects are. And anyway.
no, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that, Lindsay. Yeah, I often say that in teachings when I talk about many of these topics that fake it till you make it, because it's the only way it happens, really. I mean, how can any of these things that are brand new ways of behaving, patterns of thinking, whatever, be immediately adopted? Again, just like I was saying earlier, you can't take all of this advice that's coming in over the course of a couple of days and immediately change your life. We don't have a little switch inside there that we can just go, okay, now I'm going to be that person. You make a conscious choice to move in that direction, and you do have to fake it for a while. You do have to go, okay, I'm going to be with this person and try to have some levity and lightness with whoever they are. And maybe it's not all there, but over time it will become more natural. That's whatever. Master Shantideva, this great, Indian saint, I mentioned him with that verse that we had last night. Was it last night or no? Yeah, it was. Okay. I just want to make sure. But he says there is nothing whatsoever that doesn't become easier through through the force of familiarity. So again, the more we become familiar with something, the easier it is to do. And everything is always difficult when it's not familiar, right? When we first come in, we go, oh yeah, I know I got to do this, and well, I'm not really quite sure what I'm supposed to be doing, and it doesn't feel right. And then over time, it becomes easier. I mean, every one of us has had that experience, right? Without a doubt. Another part of our shared humanity. Let's go back to the slides. Other people are one of the greatest sources of uncertainty in our lives. True. So it is not surprising that much humor is used to manage and massage those encounters. The Archbishop and the Dalai Lama are masters of using humor to connect and join together when meeting others. And again, you can see that certainly with the Dalai Lama and a lot of his interviews with people and whatever. He manages to get people really at ease very quickly because he's just a funny guy. He really is. On humor as a source for unity, this is a Douglas Abrams asking the Archbishop, humor can also be very cruel. But your humor, as I've seen it over the years, is about bringing us together, not about separating us and putting anyone down, except maybe the Dalai Lama. As they would again put each other down quite easily and laugh at it. But he says most of the time it's about uniting. Can you two tell us a little bit about the ways in which humor can bring us together and show us our shared ridiculousness or ridiculosity or whatever the word would be? Well, yes. If you are longing to bring people together, this is the Archbishop talking, you're not going to do so by being acerbic. It's so good to see the ridiculousness in us all, really. I think we then get to see our common humanity in many ways. Again, when we kind of let down our guard and be with others from that place of just, yeah, this is just who we are, just a bunch of people looking at things in a funny way, in a humorous way, because it is kind of funny at times. Yes, there are serious things. I'm not denying that. But let's have a little bit of, again, that levity, that lightness. Ultimately, I think it's about being able to laugh at yourself and being able not to take yourself so seriously. It's not about the belittling humor that puts others down and yourself up. It's about bringing people onto common ground, once more that ground, earth. Real humor is where we kind of bring ourselves to a common ground. We can be with each other and not be poking fun at each other. Certainly, this becomes cruelty and bullying behavior and things in some avenues where people make fun of those who are lesser than in whatever way, disenfranchise in whatever way. So we have to, again, find the humor that unites people, that brings people together, that allows us to look at, again, that shared ground that we are all on. If you can manage to downgrade yourself, you're able to laugh at yourself and get others to laugh at you without feeling guilty that they are laughing at you. The humor that doesn't demean is an invitation to everyone to join in the laughter. Even if they're laughing at you, they're joining you in a laughter that feels wholesome. And we have to be careful. Some people are very sensitive, and if we start laughing at things about them and think we're being on that plane of shared humanity, but it feels like it's denigrating, well, again, be apologetic. We're going to have forgiveness coming up soon where we can ask for forgiveness of others as well as forgiving others. And so again, I think this is an important part of it though, is that usually if we have that attitude and that humility, we can laugh at ourselves and go, wow, that was pretty ridiculous what I did. Okay, so instead of talking about humor more, let's experience humor and hopefully laughter. I mean, there's no guarantees. I put together a number of these kind of Buddhism spiritually themed comics that I found on the internet. And so perhaps we can laugh at ourselves. I hope so. Here's one. I don't think I'm going to read them because I think that just kind of takes something out of them. Can you all read it? Nobody's laughing. We start with Zen cartoons. Maybe Zen cartoons aren't as funny as. Okay, let's go on to number 2 from the New Yorker. Oh, sorry. Exactly what is this nothing I've been hearing so much about? Okay, a couple chuckles there. Maybe there's a whole new category of Zen cat ladies, childless. You have a Zen cat on top of just having a cat. Anyway, sorry. Okay, this one says, okay. I've got to move something on my screen so I can read it actually. Okay, if you finished reaching enlightenment, you may go to the mall with your friends. This is on the family trip to Nirvana. And then it says, this week on the amazing race to enlightenment, can Jim and Susie achieve right mindfulness? And will Barb and Candy be eliminated for relentless clinging to the self? You watch that show? Yeah, I don't know that I want to be on it though. Okay. This is, I think you can read that one. I think that's what my meditation is like a lot. This one is a little kid saying, yeah, well, I didn't believe in reincarnation when I was your age either. And then this is Buddhist photo albums. This is when I was a fruit fly in Istanbul. Of course, we called it Constantinople back then. That was by far my shortest life. And here's me in the monarch butterfly migration of 1884. A sparrow ate me, I think. And then this is one of my favorites. Yeah, you say that life is suffering, but isn't it also complaining? I actually do a talk on complaining sometimes, and I use that as the introduction to it. But do you ever think about chucking all this and retreating to a life of mindless consumerism? That's me on the cushion sometimes too. But... And then this one, my favorite little meme. There's actually a website that's called Fake Buddhist Quotes. And a monk somewhere, I think a Theravadan monk, has decided to like research things that people put out in memes that they say are the quote of the Buddha and debunking those, and many of them. I mean, some of them are true, but I don't think the Buddha said, chill, homie, you need to let that shit go. Yeah. And if you don't like my sense of humor, well, then you can do what Prince Louis did. Just kind of go, Don's sense of humor is pretty bad. I actually have a kind of punning sense of humor sometimes. I used to read a lot of James Joyce, but anyway, concluding thoughts on humor. I don't think I woke up and presto, I was funny. I think it is something that you can cultivate. Like anything else, it is a skill. Yes, it does help if you have the inclination, and especially if you can laugh at yourself. So learn to laugh at yourself. it's really the easiest place to begin. It's about humility. Laugh at yourself and don't be so pompous and serious. If you start looking for the humor in life, you will find it. You will stop asking, why me? And start recognizing that life happens to all of us. It makes everything easier, including your ability to accept others and accept all that life will bring. Okay. So again, the practice suggestions for this, let me go ahead and go to the sheet again so we can use that as the resource since that's what you do. Whoops, I brought it up on my screen, but I didn't bring it up on your screen. Put that up there. Again, for humor, we see that first I'm kind of encouraging you to reflect on the role of humor in seeing our shared humanity, particularly by remembering times in your life when having a sense of humor helped to ease a difficult situation. Yeah. It's not that, again, we can introduce it into every situation. I'm not by any means an advocate of that because I think sometimes the humor might be inappropriate because of the gravity of what we're dealing with. But there are a lot of life situations where it does help to kind of make things a little more palatable, make things a little less intense. You know, what we're too rigid. Yes, yeah. When things get too rigid and kind of tight, and and then we just kind of need to let go and relax. The second one is when dealing with something challenging in your life, try to introduce levity into the moment, either internally or externally if appropriate. Again, you might have to gauge who you're with and what's going on. Maybe you can have kind of a little internal moment of humor that is not necessarily manifesting in terms of saying things to others or doing things that might be inappropriate. But notice that I'm sorry, I missed a word in there. Insert happens there. Notice what happens when you practice cultivating a sense of humor in that way. Sorry, that got deleted somewhere along the line. Anyway, maybe I'll put a corrected edition out there on the Google Drive. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, you can tell. Anyway, I think this is tough sometimes, but again, this is how we kind of use our humor muscle and kind of be able to look at things more humorously is by actually practicing it. Actually saying, okay, try to see the light side of this, try to see something kind of funny about this. Again, it might not be appropriate in every setting to introduce that in terms of sharing it, but there may be times where actually it might be quite useful. Any final comments from anybody in terms of humor and its role in joy? I mean, there were times, I have to admit, Lama Zopa Rinpoche could be a pretty serious dude sometimes. Some of you who had teachings from him, he would look at things pretty, I wouldn't want to use the word rigid or tight, but very much with a serious side of why we're here and what we're here to do. And in Buddhism, that can sometimes creep into our practice very much. We go, God, I've got this amazing human life and I got to do all of this. And there are so many practices to do. And, you know, but he also was very light at times. There were times when I think he could laugh at things and laugh at himself and laugh at just the general situation. I think we make much more progress on our spiritual path when we have that lightness versus, oh, I got to be so serious and deadly serious about everything. I mean, look at when you're in university or doing any kinds of studies like that. If that's your whole mentality is just keep the nose to the grindstone, you're going to burn out. You're going to have problems. So I don't know. That's my perspective is that I think we do much better in our lives when we have a more humorous approach to things and are not always so deadly serious. Yeah. Beverly, please share. I'm sorry. I'll put that back on in a minute.
Real quick, my mom passed about 6 years ago,
Sorry.
and her funeral
Mhm.
was we're Catholic.
Uh-huh.
The priest was hysterical. I have never, it was like a comedy show. Yeah, it was. And maybe some thought, and a lot of the humor he generated was towards my sister and me.
Oh,
So
wow.
real quick, at a Catholic funeral, they put the cloth over the coffin,
Mhm.
and my sister and I, it's not like a wedding where there's a rehearsal. There was no rehearsal on this, right? So we're fumbling with the sheet, and the priest said, obviously you two never made a bed before, but I never laughed so hard. And obviously we were all devastated. She passed.
Sure.
But And just one quick thing, what I do
Mm.
in the morning, sometimes to start my day, I'm not a big technology person, but I do like Facebook to see pictures, family pictures, and those reels of
Mhm.
stand-up comedians, just short, like you said, who are making fun of our commonality. The ones with golden retrievers are hysterical. We had, Goldens, or just the ones of children laughing.
Yeah.
I can watch a little clip of a baby laughing or kids laughing, and I think it's just a lovely way to start the morning.
That's great, Beverly. And thank you for sharing that about your mother's funeral. My mother passed away in June. So she was Catholic. I was raised Catholic. So that we had a Catholic funeral. And our priest was not maybe quite the comedian that yours was, but he was very light about things. And when he talked about my mother and his connection with my mother, because he used to be the parish priest there where she lived, and then he moved to the south of Indiana. And I was intent on getting him for my mother's funeral because she asked me in particular. She said, I really want this priest, Father Bill, to do the funeral, but he brought some lightness into it, and it was totally appropriate, even though, yes, it's a very sad occasion to be saying goodbye to a parent who you were so close to, throughout your whole life. And it's good to bring humor in that way. And I love this idea of, starting your day with something that lightens your mood and brings some humor. Why not?
Don, I made up a joke. How many Buddhists at the retreat center does it take to change a light bulb?
How many?
It doesn't matter. We don't have the money to do that. Please donate.
I'll tell you my Buddhist light bulb joke. That's a good one though, because that's the case for almost every center. How many Buddhists does it take to change a light bulb? How many? It depends on whether the light bulb wants to change. Anyway, please, Mary.
I had two separate thoughts. One is that I have two daughters who are wonderful people. One is very much into humor, and the other is not. So I have you. When it comes to humor, you really have to read the room
Yeah.
and be aware, because if I try to bring humor into the situation, one gets very resentful.
Oh my God.
This is not a laughing matter. This is not funny.
Right.
So you just need to know that when you're trying to be funny about something. And the other thing that I am also very lucky to have two grandchildren. One is two granddaughters, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And after spending time with them, I'm a changed person because of the humor and the laughter that I encounter when I'm with them. And
Wonderful.
it's just ridiculousness. It's silly. It's like telling a joke that doesn't even mean anything. Like, why did the frog say hi to the bird? Because he wanted to eat a hot dog. And we burst into laughter. And it goes on and on. I mean, just silliness. And it is so invigorating and so soul soothing.
Thank you, Mary, for sharing that. It's hard dealing with people who don't have the sense of humor, though, because it's like, how do you get that crack? There's that song by Leonard Cohen, like, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. But, where to find that crack, and how to get the light in there, it's tough. And I'm sure she does laugh at times, probably, maybe. I don't know. Yeah. Not over serious things. Okay. Yeah. Right. So it's just in those situations when you want to inject some laughter to not be so serious about everything. And then she's like, what are you doing? Yeah. Oh, that's a shame, but thanks for sharing that. Yeah, Carol, please.
I'm not sure I have the story correct or if it was part of this book, but every time I think of it, it just makes me smile. Apparently, the Dalai Lama is a trickster and does silly things, and he was with
Is it the
yeah,
Archbishop?
he was
Yeah.
with the Archbishop, and he did something, and the Archbishop said to him, "Act like a holy man." It just makes me, and they both burst out laughing.
Yeah. Yeah, there's again in the film Mission Joy, there's some of those clips that are like that where, the two of them interacting with each other and it's just, yeah, brings a smile and kind of helps. And I think that keeps this little sort of a glow going that we can again inject into wherever we can hopefully have some luck with that. But humor is a tough one for some people, and it's a shame that it is. But yeah, Isabella wants to share something.
Yeah, I wanted to share as well the reflection of like a child. I thought about really what you were saying when you mentioned, and also for you, Mary. Um, Reminds me of my nephew.
Uh-huh.
Like when he's 3 years old, and when we're teaching children how to respond to like suffering or negative emotions,
Mm-hmm.
you can see how susceptible they are to in the moment, like if they fall for an example and you start laughing with them rather than crying, or like influencing that negative emotion, you start laughing instead, then they'll naturally go into like a belly laugh. And so they'll start to embrace that fall or that like somewhat negative experience with laughter rather than
Right.
with immediately going to crying.
Right.
And so I think it's a really powerful way of like when you're met with suffering or something that could be seemingly negative, you can embrace it with like, joy and laughter in that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good one. I think that that's really important. I mean, and I was also thinking that maybe that's tied to some degree of having a maybe a more long-term perspective. Again, why we get so serious is because we do get kind of stuck in the moment and thinking, oh, well, what is this ever going to end? And don't really think about the fact that there's something on the other side. And maybe if we even bring some humor into that and say, well, what would it be like if this went to extremes or absurdities or something? We can see that maybe that's a way of deflating some of the seriousness at the moment. But I think there's a lot of techniques where humor you know, can play a good role. Any other comments? Again, folks online, anything anyone needed to share? Anyone else here in the compa? All right, let's do acceptance. We're going to go till about 12:30 and then we'll have our lunch. I will do my best to stop on time. This is my little cartoon that I found online for acceptance from the Calvin and Hobbes series. It says, "It's not denial. I'm just very selective about the reality I accept." There is some denial probably in there, obviously, but this is what acceptance is can we accept reality, whatever is going on? It's kind of interesting, when I first taught this the very first time, I thought, why do they have them in this order? Why is acceptance coming after, these other three? And I don't know if I've quite figured it out yet. To me, it is very much also a part of perspective. If we are looking at things initially, if we open up and accept what is going on, then there is often the opportunity for us to shift our perspective. Sometimes we might be very resistant to what's going on and not accept that whatever is happening, whatever type of suffering or difficulty we're meeting, that it's something that we then have to work with. Because acceptance seems like the invitation into working with things then, which perspective very much is about, humility is about, humor is about. But nonetheless, maybe some answers will come up for all of you as we go through this that will be enlightening for me. So when we had visited the Tibetan children village in January, this is Douglas Abrams, we noticed a wall displaying a quote that the Dalai Lama referenced in the dialogues. Once more, wonderful Master Shantideva, this incredible practitioner in the 8th century. It was a translation of his famous questions that His Holiness had mentioned, only in a slightly different translation. Why be unhappy about something if it can be remedied? And what is the use of being unhappy if it cannot be remedied? So this is the actual verse in a different translation from, I think it's Stephen Batchelor's translation of the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. If something can be done about it, what need is there for dejection? And if nothing can be done about it, what use is there for being dejected? So this is in the vein of acceptance because it's really about looking at whatever is going on for us and accepting the reality of it, accepting it for what it is. Sometimes there are things that we can do about what is happening, right? That's often the case. Have a challenging situation, and it's like we got to roll up our sleeves, get to work, and do what we need to do. Again, with maybe some humor, some levity, some enthusiasm. that's what we should be doing instead of getting all dejected and ridiculous about it, right? And oh, woe is me, poor me, I have all these difficulties and problems, and commiserating with everyone else, and just do something about it. You know, that's do the elbow grease kind of thing. You need to get in there and do the work. But there are some things in life that we can't do anything about, right? I mean, this is sometimes the case. I would say that that's probably the minority of things that we actually experience are things we can't do anything about. And of course, in Buddhism, we would say there's always something we can do about it, which is change our minds. You know, let's use the reality of death. Death is a serious thing. We were just talking about funerals and things. We all are going to have to face the reality of death. Death is going to come for every one of us. As that book about Jim Morrison was titled, No One Gets Out of Here Alive. It just doesn't happen, right? This is something we have to face. It's something we have to accept in that second vein. Well, what good does worrying about death do then? Rather, let's have a more positive attitude about it. Let's look at what I need to do to prepare for death, to have used this life well, to die with a happy mind. That's the Buddhist perspective, at least. And I would say many spiritual traditions say the same thing, recognizing your own mortality will make good use of this life then. So there are things that can be shifted. They can't change the situation necessarily, but we always can shift something. Can always find a way to, again, change our perspective, change how we are responding to something. So this it reminded me when I went through it, this book the first time, of course, of the Serenity Prayer as well. This is one version of it from Reinhold Niebuhr, who I guess is the original one, but I don't know if it was in German then or something and has been translated into English different ways. I have heard it translated somewhat differently. God, give us the strength to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, the courage to change the things which I always heard can be changed or should be changed is kind of an interesting translation, and the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. This is the essence of Shantideva's verse, essentially, right? To accept the things that can't be changed, to not get into this like really dour, ridiculous place because we're railing against something that we can't do anything about. But then the courage to do what we need to do, to roll up our sleeves and put the effort into changing the things that we actually can do something about in our lives. And then, of course, the wisdom to distinguish one from the other. That's sometimes the challenge, right? How do we know what is one, what is the other? But then again, the behavior that follows from that. Once I decide, yes, this is something I actually can do something about. And as I said in Buddhism, even if it's something we can't change outside, we can change the inside, can change how we are going to deal with that. So I actually am, as part of the practice for this one, when we get to that a little later, is really to work with either of these, because for some of you, this is a very powerful verse. I know it's used in AA a lot, and is a very powerful way of looking at our lives and really being able to kind of recognize that we are often in the driver's seat and need to do things that are responsive to what's going on. But then to really accept, the things that we can't change. And by the way, one of the things that we can't change is other people. Okay. Now, again, can we become an agent of helping them to change? Maybe yes. I mean, that's the Buddhist path too. And I think many other spiritual traditions would agree. Why do people become priests or monks or, rabbis or whatever? Because they want people to change their minds and their behavior and to become better people. But we can't change them. People can only change themselves. So that's an important thing to acknowledge. Yeah, we can do what we can to offer, to help people to see things in a different light, but it's really up to each individual to decide what change they're willing to go through and accept. So I'm just throwing that out there. Maybe you disagree with me. Maybe you think you can change people. But I would say we can become a catalyst for change. We can help other people. But are we the actual, can we get in there and make them exactly who we want them to be? Well, good luck with that. Didn't work with my parents and me. Them trying to make me into what they wanted me to be. But anyway, back to the slides. Let's go a little deeper into this topic of acceptance. In this short teaching, meaning particularly that verse by Shantideva, is the profound essence of the Dalai Lama's approach to life. It was at the root of his stunning ability to accept the reality of his exile without, as the Archbishop put it, being morose. And we all have our own tragedies and our own wounds that have happened in our lives, some apparently greater than others. We don't want to put that judgment on, because for some people, some things are really cataclysmic in their lives. But, do we become morose? Do we give up? Do we resign ourselves to that and not become better people on the basis of that? It's maybe another one of those kind of silver lining things that we saw in perspective. Is it possible that we can look at anything that we are experiencing, come to accept it, and come to actually grow from it? It's more growth is a common theme through a lot of these, as we've seen already in this weekend. Once we see life in its wider perspective, the first pillar, once we are able to see our role in its drama with some degree of humility, the second pillar, and once we are able to laugh at ourselves, we then come to the fourth and final quality of mind, which is the ability to accept our life in all its pain, imperfection, and beauty. So, in answer to my little dilemma I mentioned earlier about why is acceptance fourth rather than earlier on, this is how Douglas Abrams frames it, at least. And I don't know, again, whether this was wisdom that came from the Archbishop and the Dalai Lama as well. But again, we can see the logic to that. These three pillars do precede it to some degree, where then we can come to a place of, with that perspective, shift in perspective, with our humility, with a sense of humor, then maybe we can begin to accept life and everything that it has to offer. Its warts and its flowers and everything else in between, all the things that make life what it is, the rich, kind of range of things that we experience in life. Again, I know it's hard when you deal with really, really difficult stuff, and some people deal with traumatic things in their lives. I'm not denying that maybe many of you in the room have had pretty traumatic experiences that you've had to heal from. But it all starts with acceptance, accepting that that has happened. Now, in Buddhism, it has its own explanation about why things happen, and I'm not going to get into too much of that this weekend, because again, this isn't really about putting all that forward, but we might have a spiritual context for being able to look at this. In Buddhism, we would accept that what is happening to us is a product of what we have done in the past, what we call our karma. That it's not something that's just randomly landing on our porch. That's not why things happen. They happen because we have been an active agent in creating those things, which immediately then we go to guilt. We go, oh, it must have been a really horrible person because I created that. Not the right response. Rather to say, oh, if I created this, well, then how did I create it? What's going on here? What can I learn from this? That's the way we actually use this idea of karma as a way to accept what's happening and learn from it. And I don't think that's that much different than what His Holiness and the Archbishop are saying in this section on acceptance. If we accept something, then we bring it and we go, okay, then what do I do about this? In Buddhism, of course, because things are created from past karma, well, then we have to address, are we doing those same things that would cause us to have that same experience again? Or are we doing something different? Have we changed our minds? Is it possible to actually learn from what we're experiencing as like a mirror that says, guess what? You've got some things you need to address here and here and here. And then you address them. That's again part of Shantideva's verse. Well, then you do something. Don't be dejected about it. Don't feel horrible. I have this horrible thing happening. This is actually a product of my own mind, a product of my own creation. Again, I'm just throwing that out there as that's helpful sometimes to have a spiritual perspective about how you can look at acceptance and begin to accept, especially as we're going to see one of the main topics in this section, accepting suffering in our lives. No one, again, gets by without any suffering in their lives. Impossible, right? Unless you're maybe, even if you're born the moment after birth, you probably suffered in birth, coming through the birth canal. They say it's not a very pleasant experience. I wasn't conscious of that and can't think about it. I was, bring it to mind, but I was certainly conscious being going through that. So again, these are the 5 topics that I've identified that are discussed in this section. What is and isn't meant by acceptance, to be really clear about what it means to accept what's going on in our lives. The relationship of acceptance to joy, and once more, this becomes a key part of each of these, really looking at its relationship. And then the acceptance of suffering in particular, as I mentioned, a very important aspect. Fourth, the role of Buddhist practice in acceptance. Again, I touch on that a little bit, but we'll go into that a little more detail. And then the paradox of acceptance and goals. Because acceptance, again, doesn't mean we become complacent. Oh, I just accept that I'm in this kind of state of having a crazy, deluded mind and going through life and whatever. And it means that we can also make some changes that will move in a different direction. So first, what does it mean? Acceptance, it must be pointed out, is the opposite of resignation and defeat. The Archbishop and the Dalai Lama are two of the most tireless activists for creating a better world for all of its inhabitants. But their activism comes from a deep acceptance of what is. It's not like we're going to can just say, oh, climate change, just resign ourselves to just doing nothing. Again, that's one of the responses, as Joanna Macy said, that's one of the stories we can adopt in dealing with things in our world, is just go, it's overwhelming and it's just depressing and I'm just not going to go there. But we can also just do our share, to take the steps that we take, accepting that this is what's going on in our world, accepting that there is a reality to all of this that we need to then be aware of and change our behavior on the basis of. The Archbishop did not accept the inevitability of apartheid in South Africa, but he did accept its reality. We are meant to live in joy, the Archbishop explained. This does not mean that life will be easy or painless. It means that we can turn our faces to the wind and accept that this is the storm we must pass through. I know in many times in Christianity, they have, at least my mother demonstrated this very much when she was dealing with my father's passing, as well as other challenges she had in her life, where she had this idea that God only gives her what she can deal with, kind of fills her plate with what will be something that she can handle. And that's kind of a nice perspective in some ways. Again, in Buddhism, we don't hold to the view of a creator God kind of doling out things left and right to various beings. But this was helpful for her to actually look at, okay, I'm going through this really tough time, but this is God kind of testing me the same way that they have the book of Job, where Job was really tested around his faith in God and so on. They look at that as kind of like a challenge. Like, can I learn to accept what's going on in my life and actually get through it, go through the storm? Very powerful way, again, that in that tradition, they are able to muster up that kind of acceptance and determination. In Buddhism, we would use different tools, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but I already talked to some degree about how we can come to accept it as part of our own creation, something that we created through the force of our own prior behavior, our karma. Okay, we cannot succeed by denying what exists. The acceptance of reality is the only place from which change can begin. Because of course, if we don't accept reality, well, how will we even know what to change? This is the one thing going back to climate change. If we actually look at it, come to understand the science of it, come to bring forward the people who have expert knowledge around this, well, I'm sure they have very good suggestions about how we can deal with it. And of course, many of those suggestions have made it into the public awareness and people are doing their share and what have you. So again, this is how change actually happens, but you have to accept that it's happening. And I know in this country, we still have many people who deny the reality of climate change still to this day. And it's been decades since they've been talking about this. You remember? Um, I don't know when An Inconvenient Truth was released, which was a bigger, larger kind of film that got people's awareness around what's happening to our planet. But this was being talked about back in like the 70s and 80s. Many people saying, guess what, folks? We're moving in a particular trajectory. So again, if you don't accept it, you're not going to do anything to change. You're not going to do anything to address it. Don't want to belabor that point, but I think it is very important. The Archbishop had said that when one grows in the spiritual life, quote, you are able to accept anything that happens to you, end quote. You accept the inevitable frustrations and hardships as part of the warp and woof of life. The question, he had said, is not how do we escape it? The question is, how can we use this as something positive? Of course, this is where when we get into talking about suffering and the Buddhist path, we're very much about using all those experiences as grist for the mill. We don't want to shut out anything. We don't want to say, okay, I'm going to be very selective. I'm only going to use the joyful, wonderful, delightful experiences and to hell with, all these awful, challenging, horrible experiences. It's all on our plate, folks. It's all there being served for a reason. So let's again, work with it. You have to accept that. Don't try to escape from the sides that you don't like. So on the relation of acceptance to joy, acceptance, whether we believe in God or not, allows us to move into the fullness of joy. It allows us to engage with life on its own terms rather than rail against the fact that life is not as we would wish. It allows us not to struggle against the day-to-day current. That level of acceptance that we just go, okay, this is life. I mean, the very first truth that the Buddha taught, and we'll do a little teaching on the basics of Buddhism, is that life, well, you often use the phrase, the truth of suffering, or that life is suffering. That was in that little cartoon, right? They say that life is suffering, but isn't it also complaining? But the idea is that this is not suffering in the face of, like, most people, when you ask them on the street, are you suffering right now? They'd go, well, no, I'm fine, not really sick, the weather's okay. I'm got enough money in my wallet, whatever. They're not really suffering. But the Buddha doesn't define suffering in quite that way. The Buddha says that we're kind of dealing with a state of dissatisfaction. Things are not satisfactory. Because even when we get the wonderful things, they don't last. They don't really satisfy ultimately. So there's a lot of things the Buddha taught to kind of get us in that vein of recognizing that life isn't going to give you all the time one thing. It's going to give you a variety of things. And we need to see that, again, from a Buddhist perspective, it's all sort of unsatisfactory at a very deep level. Might not appear that way, but again, that's not to make us depressed. The Buddha went after the very first noble truth. These four noble truths he taught that are the essence of his teaching. He said, what is the cause of that? Why are we in that state of being subject to what he called dukkha? Dukkha is this dissatisfaction, unsatisfactory state. Well, it's because of things we have within our own minds that are causing it. Our own deluded ways of looking at things, all the mistaken states of mind that follow from that, and the karma that we create on the basis of that. That's what's keeping us in this state. And we often call this samsara because that means circling, going from life to life and never really finding any real peace or satisfaction. You might think, wow, it's a pretty depressing view. And if the Buddha only gave two noble truths, it would be. It would be like, if he said, okay, life is dukkha, it's unsatisfactory, and you're causing it through your own mind and your behavior. Good luck with that, Let me know how it works out for you. Well, then the Buddha wouldn't be such a great guy, right? Like, thanks a lot. You just told me that I'm now, like, looking at my life in a really miserable way. The Buddha went on in the third noble truth to say, guess what, folks? There can be an end to all of that. And you're like, wow, really? Okay. And then the natural question is, how do I do that? That's the fourth noble truth, the truth of the path that will lead to an end of that. So again, a Buddhist perspective on this is that when we come to accept that life is what it is, that it is by its very nature unsatisfactory, which is not quite exactly what is being said in the book. Don't get me wrong. I recognize that, the Dalai Lama didn't throw the complete thing in everyone's face. He acknowledges that the Archbishop is there and has a very different view of what life is. But if we accept life for whatever it is, whatever our spiritual tradition tells us what it is, or whatever we come to discern what it is through our own investigation, then we have a starting point. And that's a starting point for that's why he taught the first two truths at the beginning. It was like, guess what, folks? I hate to tell you, you're not really in such a great situation. You have to come to accept that that's what it is. And then you can do the work in the last two truths. You can actually accomplish something that is the antithesis of this, the opposite of this. And again, really, thank you, Buddha, giving us that wonderful advice. But this starts with some measure of acceptance. And I think, again, as I was saying with what my mother brought to mind of God only gives you as much as you can handle. Well, that's an acknowledgement that you're not always going to get it, that bowl of roses or whatever. What, is that the right phrase? I think I'm mixing my metaphors. Bowl of cherries. So I can laugh at myself, I think. Um, a bowl of cherries, not a bowl of roses. A bed of roses. There we go. Okay. Great. So this is, I think, important when we talk about acceptance, particularly, again, there's some joy, some relief when we're not struggling against this. I mean, initially, when people hear the Buddhist teachings on the Four Noble Truths, there might be some resistance. Like, really? I tried to get this across to my brother once, very early on in my Dharma career, and I mucked it up, and he just like goes, "Life is not suffering. Get out of here," you know. Anyway, the Dalai Lama had told us that stress and anxiety come from our expectations of how life should be. When we are able to accept that life is how it is, not as we think it should be, we are able to ease the ride, to go from that bumpy axle. That's the literal translation of this word dukkha. It's like an axle that is off kilter so that you end up having a bumpy ride, you know, across the terrain, you know, with all its suffering, stress, anxiety, and dissatisfaction, to the smooth axle, sukha. There's even a realm called the land of joy, Sukhavati. And this is kind of the greater ease, comfort, and happiness that happens when we kind of move in that direction. But you have to acknowledge that you're starting from dukkha. You're starting from the bumpy ride. You know, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride. So accepting suffering in particular, let me see where we're at time-wise. I think I'm going to stop here. Okay. We'll talk about the acceptance of suffering when we come back. But I would like to invite people, it's just an invitation, and I'll come here at 3 o'clock just to get things started. Maybe I'll hang around. I don't know. I really like discussions to happen without the teacher there because otherwise it becomes more of a Q&A. But if people would like to discuss anything that we've talked about, I don't want to necessarily steer your discussion. We've talked about things that I think are worth spending a little time going into with each other. Then come back here at around 3, and we'll just go from like 3 till 3:40, somewhere in there. I'll leave you self-manage, you know, talk for as long as you wish, but make sure you do give yourself a little break because when we get back at 4, we will do from 4 to 5:30, right? Isn't that and then we'll have our dinner break for 6 o'clock is dinner, and then 7 to 8:30, okay? But I'll come back just to get things started, you know, and you can break off into smaller groups. And it's kind of nice sometimes to be with, if you came here with someone else, maybe be with a group where that person isn't there. And if you want them to be there, that's fine. I just think sometimes it's useful to kind of get out of our little comfort zone, maybe of someone who we might be more like-minded with and be with other people who we might learn something more from. So any questions or comments about anything I've talked about so far today, particularly this last bit on humility, humor, acceptance? I haven't quite gotten through with acceptance, but yes, Lindsay, please.
I heard you earlier say that we don't have to focus on all of these all at once.
Right.
So I just wondered before we take our break and have some time to reflect, if you have any thoughts about how we suss out where to focus and just, you know, anything that comes to mind in response to that question.
Okay. Again, when we finish and we've gone through all 8 pillars, hopefully I'll get through all of them, then I think the process after you leave the retreat to some degree, maybe it can happen even during, but is to kind of take a look at those and read it through and do an assessment of your own life. I think it is hard for us sometimes to look at ourselves objectively. I'm not denying that. To actually look and go, okay, what is it that is kind of my go-to thing that I should really be working on? Now, there are 2 different theories around this. I certainly have heard many teachers say that you should start with something that's maybe a little easier for you to take on and to maybe it's not your big thing that's bugging you or causing you difficulties in your life, but it's something that is easier to adopt, you know. And there is something to be said for that because then we get kind of feather in our cap when we adopt something that we can say, oh, wow, this isn't so bad. I can make some progress. There's some benefit to that. So I'm not denying that that may be an approach that some people might like. They might say, oh, I'm just going to shift my perspective a little. I'm going to work with that because that sounds a lot less challenging than forgiveness or all these other things. Nothing wrong with that. But there is some merit to saying that you're going to work with the thing that's the toughest one first, the thing that you go, okay, I see that I really need to focus on my humility, that my pride is just way too out of whack. Because what happens when you are able to tackle like the big mountain first is then the small mountain seems so much more manageable. You can get that bigger feather in your cap that you don't have to worry about the amount of effort perhaps that you're going to have to put in to overcome some of the other things that are going on. So there's a period of self-reflection, self-investigation where we look at it and we'd make a decision then on the basis of an inventory. I'm not saying again that these 8 are targeting everything you need to work on, because these are just a suggestion that came out of a dialogue happening for 5 days in Dharamsala, India. They're not necessarily the key to life, but they are pretty good in terms of touching on a lot of major stuff that we all need to work on to some degree. So the point is do that self-inventory and really look at this and say, okay, I see that for me, what is happening is blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to choose to do one of those 2 approaches. I'm going to choose to tackle that big mountain first, or I'm going to choose maybe to work on something that might be easier. So I get a little more confidence, and then I can maybe tackle the big mountain over time. That's the advice I can give you in terms of how to work with that process. Of course, don't expect immediate change either. That's another thing to put out there. Even with the simpler things, sometimes it might take a little while. But just be patient with yourself. Recognize that we are, again, creatures of habit, and it'll take a while for us to move in a different direction, to get our thoughts in a different perspective, and be patient with that. And recognize it's often, I mean, I should share that one little cartoon that I initially had in there and I took it out. Let me see if I can find it real quick. This little thing on, whoops, let's see if I can find. I think I know the title I gave to the cartoon, so I should be able to pull it up pretty quickly. There it is. Maybe you'll laugh at this one more. I don't know. You laughed pretty well at the ones I had, though. I have to admit, I was pleasantly surprised with the laughter. Okay. This is a little cartoon about spiritual journeys. You know, this is how we see other spiritual journeys, right? You know, it takes a bit of effort, but it's kind of an uphill and you get there, you know, in a pretty straightforward way. But then we see our own spiritual journey being like all over the place and like gasping for air because we're drowning in it. You know, that may be the feeling often, but to just recognize that you're doing what you need to do. It might be a few steps forward and then a lot of steps backward, and it might be all over the place and zigzaggy and everything. Everyone's journey probably looks more like the second one than the first one. Trust me on that. We're more all over the place and kind of seeing a little progress and then a little regress and then a little more progress and a little more regress. That's the only way to get there. So I don't know if that helps. But for just the basic advice of working between sessions, I would certainly encourage you to just take a look at what may have piqued your interest from the previous session. You know, so from either last night or all of this morning, you know, for the few hours that you have before we get back here, then think about, you know, what was it that kind of drew you in? And what is it, something that you could maybe put a little more time into thinking about or journaling about or whatever? You don't need to do all the work here this weekend. There'll be plenty of time for the work when you leave. So, rather than taking more questions and comments, I said I'd get everyone out around 12:30 and it's 12:35 already. So notorious. Okay, so let's have a little dedication, a little thought of dedication at the end of this. Once more, reconnecting with our motivation. Why are we here? Yeah, we're here to instill more joy in our own hearts so we can become a source of joy for others. We can bring joy, happiness, peace, well-being into all beings' lives. And we dedicate for that result. Through what we've done here today, may it become a cause for us to find our deepest joy, happiness, well-being, and to lead others to attaining that as well, becoming a catalyst for their progress towards their ultimate well-being. Okay, take our break. So please enjoy lunch. Talk to each other during lunch if you want, and then be back here around 3. Those of you who wish, and we'll do a little breakout into discussion groups.